Have you ever seen a moment so ordinary it became unforgettable? It was raining that night, heavy drops tapping against the window of a small bar tucked on the corner of a quiet street. The world outside was dark, neon lights flickering, and the sidewalks glistened with reflections of passing cars. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and cheap bourbon. He sat there, a single dad, hands rough from years under car hoods, engine oil still clinging to the lines of his palms. His name was Jack. In front of him, a glass of water and a folded bill he couldn't pay, the ink smudged from his wet fingers. His eyes were tired, the kind of tired you don't sleep off, the kind you carry when every day feels like a fight you're losing. Across the bar, the door opened with a gust of cold wind, and she walked in. Her heels clicked on the worn floor. A woman in a dark blazer, her hair pulled back so tightly it looked like it hurt. She didn't look around. She just sat down next to him, even though the bar was almost empty, in order to drink she didn't touch. Jack glanced at her, the way strangers sometimes do, and noticed her hands were trembling. She had a phone in her palm, the screen lighting up over and over with messages she didn't read. Her eyes were somewhere far away, dark and stormy, matching the rain outside. "You look like you just lost everything," Jack said, not even sure why the words came out. She didn't answer at first. Her lips parted, closed, and then she let out a small, broken laugh, the kind that sounds like glass cracking. She turned to him, and for the first time their eyes met. "What if I did, Anna?" She whispered. And in that moment, the bar wasn't just a bar. It became the only place in the world where two people, both drowning in their own storms, found a moment of quiet. Jack nodded slowly, swallowing the bitterness in his mouth. "Then you're not alone." They sat there in silence, listening to the rain, the world outside moving too fast for either of them to catch up. Her phone buzzed again. She silenced it. He looked back at his bill, at the water, at the reflection of himself looking older than he felt. She left before he could say anything else, leaving her drink untouched, the scent of her perfume lingering like a question. Jack didn't even know her name. But as he stepped out into the rain that night, he didn't know that tomorrow she would return. And when she did, she wouldn't be looking for anyone else. She would come back to that bar just for him. Stay with me. Because in the next 24 hours, everything Jack knew about his life would be shattered. And you won't believe what happened next. Jack Turner woke before the sun, the cold creeping through the thin walls of the small apartment he shared with his daughter. He watched Lily, just 7 years old, still asleep in her blanket cocoon, her small hand clutching the stuffed rabbit she'd had since the hospital. She wheezed softly, the sound tightening his chest in fear every time he heard it, reminding him that her inhaler was almost empty, that he needed to find the money for a refill. The world never waited for a single dad to catch up. He worked long days at the auto shop on Maple Street, fixing brakes and changing oil, the owner paying him in cash so he could save a few dollars from taxes. Every cent counted. Jack never complained, even when his back ached and the smell of gasoline clung to him like a second skin. Because Lily needed him to keep going, to keep trying, to keep breathing for her. When the nights got too long and the landlord knocked too hard on the door asking for rent, have you ever carried so much on your shoulders that you forgot how to look up at the stars? Jack didn't have the luxury of dreams anymore. He didn't think about what he wanted, only what Lily needed. The inhaler, the school lunches, the rent, the electric bill that was overdue again. The quiet moments he had were when Lily fell asleep on his chest and he whispered promises he wasn't sure he could keep. That's why, when he walked into that bar after a long day, all he wanted was to sit down for a moment, to breathe, to be invisible. But she made him visible again. Her name was Elena Carter, CEO of a tech startup that had exploded into the market with promises of changing the world. Her face on magazine covers, her speeches about leadership and innovation going viral on social media. People saw a woman who had it all, the sharp suits, the million-dollar smile, the confidence that made rooms go quiet when she walked in. But Elena was alone, more alone than anyone could have imagined. She had built her empire with everything she had, sacrificing family, friends, love, and sleep. Her days were meetings in boardrooms, Her nights filled with endless reports and the quiet hum of the city outside her high-rise window. She had fought to get where she was, fought harder than anyone knew, but she didn't realize that the closer she got to the top, the colder it became. Elena held a secret that kept her up at night, one she couldn't share with anyone. Her company, the one she thought she controlled, was bleeding from the inside, drained by the hands of the very people she trusted. Her CFO, her board, those who smiled at her in meetings, were siphoning money into shell accounts, laundering it through vendors she never approved. And when she found out, the threats came quietly, hidden in polite words and forced smiles. If she spoke up, she would lose everything. Her investors would vanish, her employees would scatter, and her dream would die. And she was so tired. That was why she sat at that bar, next to a man who smelled like oil and rain, who looked at her like she was a person and not a title. She didn't know why she sat next to him, why his words cut through her armor so easily. Maybe it was the way he said, "You look like you just lost everything," or the way he didn't try to impress her, didn't try to pitch an idea, didn't look at her phone lighting up with messages she couldn't face. Maybe it was the way he looked so tired, the kind of tired she recognized in the mirror every morning. Elena left that night, but she couldn't shake the way his eyes saw her, the way he said, "Then you're not alone." She went back to her apartment, staring out at the city lights, the towers that pierced the sky, the emptiness of it all. And she made a decision. The next night when the rain came again, when the city smelled like wet asphalt and neon, Elena walked back into that bar. Her hands were shaking, her heart was pounding, and she sat down in the same seat next to him. "Hi," she said softly. Jack looked up, startled, the ghost of a tired smile crossing his lips. "You came back." Elena nodded, her eyes glistening with the weight of everything she couldn't say. And in that moment, under the hum of the old lights and the sound of rain, two people who were drowning found themselves reaching for air together. She came back just for him, and neither of them knew that their lives were about to collide in a way that would change everything. Jack never meant to see her again. That second night, when Elena sat down next to him, he thought it was a mistake, a moment she would regret in the morning before returning to her world of glass offices and people in tailored suits who never looked him in the eye. But she came back, and something about the way her shoulders dropped when she saw him made him stay. They didn't talk about who they were that night. Instead, they spoke of small things, of the way the rain smelled on warm concrete, of the coffee at the diner on Fifth that was too bitter but cheap enough to drink, of the way the city never slept, even when you needed it to. Elena laughed, a sound that was surprised her, and Jack found himself smiling, even though he didn't remember the last time he had. Have you ever felt seen for the first time in years by someone who didn't owe you anything? Jack didn't tell her about Lily, about the rent notices, about the way he checked the inhaler every night to count how many breaths it might give his daughter if she had another attack. He didn't tell her about the dreams that came sometimes, where he saw Lily coughing, reaching for him, and he woke up gasping, praying it wouldn't happen for real. Those were stories too heavy to place on a bar counter. But Elena saw something in his eyes, the weight he carried, the lines on his hands, the quiet fear that hid behind his tired smile. She saw it because she carried her own weight, different but just as heavy. And when she looked at him, it was like she was looking in a mirror. 3 nights later, she asked him to drive her somewhere. She didn't explain why, and Jack didn't ask, because the way she held the piece of paper in her hand, crumpled from being folded and unfolded too many times, told him she didn't have the words yet. They drove out of the city, past the bright lights and the endless noise, into the industrial district where warehouses loomed like silent watchers in the fog. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick, the kind that made it hard to breathe, as if the world was holding itself still, waiting. Elena got out of the car, her heels clicking on the wet pavement, echoing in the empty street. Jack followed, unsure why he was there, unsure why he cared, but unable to leave her standing alone. She handed him the paper. "I need you to see this." Jack unfolded it slowly, the paper damp at the edges, and saw spreadsheets, names, transactions that meant nothing to him at first. But as he read, he saw the numbers, the names of vendors, the shell companies, the dates. He looked up at her, confusion mixing with a creeping dread. My company, Elena whispered, her voice cracking. They've been stealing for years, from clients, from partners, from people who trusted us. Jack didn't know what to say. He wasn't a lawyer, he wasn't a cop, he was just a mechanic who barely made it through each month. But the way she looked at him, like he was the only person she could trust, made his heart pound. Why are you showing me this? Well, he asked. Because I don't know who else to trust, she said, her eyes glistening with tears she refused to let fall. And because your company, the auto shop you worked for 10 years ago, it went under, didn't it? Jack froze. She took a deep breath. It wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't know until I found these documents. They forced your shop to sell the land under you, raised your rent until you couldn't pay, because they wanted the property for a client. You lost everything because of us. The words hit him like a punch. The memories came back, sharper than they had in years. His father's hands stained with grease, shaking as he packed up the tools for the last time. His mother sitting on the floor, crying quietly, thinking no one could hear her. The day they left their home, the only home Jack had ever known, because there was nowhere else to go. Jack stepped back, the paper falling from his hand. Why are you telling me this now? Because I want to make it right, Elena said, stepping closer, her voice trembling. I can't change what happened, but I can stop them from doing it to others. I can expose them, but if I do, I'll lose everything. Jack stared at her, anger and grief and something else twisting inside him. He wanted to yell, to walk away, to leave her standing there with her guilt and her promises. But then he thought of Lily, of the nights he promised her that the world could be good, that people could do the right thing, even when it was hard. What do you want me to do? He asked, his voice low. I want you to take this to someone who can help, she said. I can't. They're watching me. They'll destroy me if I try. Jack shook his head. Why me? Because you're the only person I know who still believes in doing the right thing, Elena said. And because I need someone brave enough to try. He didn't answer. He just picked up the paper, folding it carefully, his hands steady even though his heart was racing. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the fear in her eyes, the desperation, the hope. Okay, Jack said finally, I'll help you. And in that moment, something shifted. The mechanic who couldn't pay his bills became the man holding the key to a truth that could take down giants. The single dad who felt invisible became the person who could change everything. They drove back in silence, the city lights welcoming them like distant stars, the dawn creeping over the horizon. Jack dropped Elena off at her apartment, their eyes meeting one last time before she stepped out. Thank you, she whispered. Jack nodded, driving away, the paper burning in his pocket like a promise he didn't know how to keep. That night, as he watched Lily sleep, her small chest rising and falling, Jack made a choice. He would fight, not just for her, but for every promise he made, for every family who lost everything, for every quiet moment where he swore the world could be better. Jack didn't know what would happen next, but he knew this. He wasn't alone anymore, and neither was she. Because sometimes the people who seem the weakest carry the courage to change the world. Stay with me, because what happened next would shock everyone. Jack sat alone in his small kitchen, the early morning light seeping through the cracked blinds, turning everything a soft gold that didn't match the heaviness in his chest. The paper Elena gave him was spread out on the table, alongside a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. Lily's soft breathing from the other room was the only sound that kept him steady. He could have walked away. It would have been easier to pretend he never saw those numbers, those names, that truth. He was a single dad with bills to pay, a child to protect, a life already heavy enough. But that wasn't the promise he made to Lily on those nights when she was too afraid to sleep, when he whispered that the world could still be good, that people could still be kind. Have you ever stood at a crossroads, knowing the path you chose would change everything? Jack took a breath and picked up the papers, sliding them into an envelope, his hands shaking only once before he steadied himself. He didn't know who to trust, but he remembered a local journalist, someone who once came into his shop to get a flat tire fixed and didn't have enough to pay. Jack had covered the difference, telling him to pay it back when he could. The man did, bringing a warm coffee the next day as thanks. Sometimes kindness circles back when you least expect it. Jack found the journalist, told him everything. He showed him the papers, explained what Elena had discovered, how it connected to the auto shop Jack's family lost, how many others had suffered under the weight of greed, hidden behind polite smiles and polished shoes. The journalist listened, taking notes, his eyes sharp, understanding the weight of the story that had fallen into his hands. "Are you ready for what this will bring?" the journalist asked, his voice calm. Jack nodded even though he wasn't ready, but he was willing, and sometimes that was enough. The story broke within days, headlines screaming across the city about corruption, fraud, betrayal at the highest levels. Elena's company became the center of a storm, investors pulling out, board members scrambling to cover their tracks. And in the middle of it, Elena stood in front of cameras, her eyes clear, her voice steady as she told the truth. She confessed everything she knew, exposing the corruption, the theft, the manipulation that had destroyed families and stolen lives. She named names, showed evidence, and stood firm even as her world shook around her. Have you ever seen someone stand up for what is right, even when it costs them everything? Jack watched it all unfold on the small TV in his living room, Lily sitting beside him, her small hand clutching his. He didn't understand every word, but he understood enough. He saw Elena's face, the way she looked when she spoke, unafraid, finally free. The backlash came quickly, but so did the support. Employees rallied behind Elena, clients demanded justice, and the authorities stepped in, investigating the fraud that had taken so much from so many. Days later, there was a knock on Jack's door. Elena stood there looking tired but alive, her eyes softer than he'd ever seen them. "You did it. Always real, ring," she said. "No," Jack replied, shaking his head. "You did." They stood there for a moment, two people who had once been strangers at a bar, now bound by something deeper, something real. Elena reached into her bag and handed him a check, a settlement from the company, enough to cover the debt that had destroyed his family, enough to pay for Lily's treatments, enough to give them a chance at a life they had lost long ago. Jack stared at it, his hands trembling. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll use it to build the life you deserve," Elena whispered, tears in her eyes. "Say you'll forgive yourself for things that were never your fault." Jack nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He looked at Lily, who was watching from the doorway, her eyes wide and hopeful. That night they stood on the balcony, the city lights blinking around them like stars, the air cool and alive. Jack held Lily in his arms, and for the first time in a long time, he let himself believe that tomorrow could be better. Elena stood beside them, looking out at the city she once ruled from behind glass, now seeing it for what it was. A place where people struggled, fought, and loved, a place worth fighting for. And in that quiet moment, a single dad and a once lonely CEO found something they didn't know they were searching for. Hope. Stay with me. Because what came after would remind them both that sometimes the hardest fights bring the brightest mornings. Jack stood in the doorway of Lily's room, watching her sleep, the soft rise and fall of her breathing like a quiet promise that everything was going to be okay. The check from Elena was tucked safely in a drawer, but it wasn't the money that mattered most. It was the way Lily laughed when she ran through the park that afternoon, her hair catching the light, her giggles echoing as if the world itself was laughing with her. Sometimes, the smallest moments carry the heaviest meaning. Jack thought about that night at the bar, the rain tapping on the windows, the heaviness in his chest when he first saw Elena's trembling hands. He remembered how broken she looked, how broken he felt, two strangers carrying the weight of worlds on their shoulders. And he remembered the moment she came back, just for him, when they both decided to believe that maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to fight alone. Have you ever felt that flicker of hope, even when everything else felt lost? Elena visited often now, bringing coffee in the mornings, sitting with Lily while Jack worked, learning how to live outside boardrooms and headlines. She would sit on the floor, helping Lily color, the crayons staining her hands in bright reds and blues, and Jack would watch them, something warm and unfamiliar filling the empty spaces in his chest. They weren't a family in the way most people would see it, but in their own quiet way, they were building something real, something worth fighting for. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Elena turned to Jack, her eyes reflecting the soft glow of the fading day. "You once told me I wasn't alone," she said softly. "You saved me that night, Jack." Jack shook his head, a small, tired smile on his lips. "We saved each other." She reached for his hand, holding it gently, and for a moment the world felt still, safe, and possible. If you've ever felt like your story didn't matter, like your quiet courage was unseen, let this remind you, your bravery can change everything. Sometimes it takes a single dad with calloused hands and a tired smile to remind the world what kindness looks like. Sometimes it takes someone who has everything to lose to find the courage to do what's right. And sometimes it just takes two people meeting at a bar on a rainy night to change the course of their lives forever. Stay with me, story family, because stories like Jack and Elena's remind us that there is a light after darkness, that hope can bloom in the quiet spaces, that kindness can ripple outward in ways we may never see. And if this story touched you, if it reminded you that the world still holds second chances, share it. Let someone else know that they're not alone, that their courage matters, that there is always a way forward. Because next, we'll uncover another hidden hero's triumph, and you won't want to miss it.